Great. Well, thanks so much. And I think a few of you at least were on this session. It was about a month ago, and this got launched out of that session. And so part of my job this morning in saying hello, is really to kind of tie this into that session. So let me do that. And I thought I would share a little something that happened to me a couple of weeks ago. So some of you know I've recently published a book, and my book, this is the advert, right? My book is on how organizations can learn from the indigenous science of uncertainty. So as we do when we publish books and we realize that no one knows if we've published it and no one's going to buy it, you've got to do this marketing thing. So I reached out to a local best-selling author in South Africa. He's also a business speaker, and he's just written a book a year or two ago on navigating uncertainty. And so I said, I'd love to send you my book. And this was through LinkedIn. And he got back to me really fast. He was very kind. And he said, don't send me your book. He said, I won't get around to reading it. And I said, well, fair enough, I thought. And then I was struck by another thought. That kind of touch of uncertainty in the touch of certainty in his statement. Not just that he wouldn't read it, which I thought was honest and probably, entirely plausible given how busy he is. But there was this hovering doubt in the back of my mind and maybe in his, I don't know. But the doubt that an indigenous knowledge system, particularly one that foregrounds something like divination, had anything useful to teach us about uncertainty at all. And I could have been wrong about him. But my assumption is not unreasonable if we went to business school and then spent most of our lives in corporate. And if I was right, it's exactly the kind of certainty, that Joan Lurie was speaking about in our previous wax and gold session. And we were trying to look at uncertainty and the deep uncertainty. And Joan said something that kind of, I think, kind of rippled through the session. Towards the end, she said, what if certainty itself is the risk? And she's talking there about the certainty that says my current maps and models are working for me now, so anything else feels superfluous, especially in uncertainty when they also feel taxing. Anything over and above what seems to be working feels taxing. And again, this is not uncommon in the Western mind. But I think it's where Africa's Ngoma systems tend to be a little bit different. And so I'm going to just dive into those a little bit and give you some perspective on why I think they are different. So for people who don't know, Ngoma knowledge systems emerged about 4,000 years ago. So they're not sort of 20, 30, 50,000 years ago. It's 4,000 years ago. They emerged in Central and East Africa. And it was a time when people were slowly transitioning to farming. And the farmers, and along with their knowledge system, migrated slowly southwards. And it took 2,000 years. It wasn't, this sudden movement. They reached Southern Africa, where all four of us here am from, and others on the call. They reached this place early in the first millennium. So basically, the year naughtish. And along the way, as people do who travel and migrate slowly, Ngoma practitioners, who were the people who held the knowledge system of these farming communities, encountered people, different groups, different tribes, different societies, who worked with things in different ways. And it wasn't just like, oh, I don't have the time or the interest, like I'm really busy planting my crops. How do you make better decisions? How do you work with spirits? Because these are all animist societies. Let me try and see what happens if I do what you do. So very pragmatic, genuinely curious. The opposite of certitude, right? Because people are now moving, migrating, and they're having problems. Rats get into the granaries, there's conflict, they're trying to find how they can sow their crops in new places. And then, as I said, pragmatic in the sense of getting better at what we're doing is crucial to our relating. It's crucial to our survival. And maybe just to put in one more thing, central to the system is the practice of divination. And it's not, the superstitious prediction that I think it's often made out to be by Western people. But traditionally, divination was a social act, not a transactional one done by an expert for a payment. It's something that people did together. where they were in the marketplaces, in the squares. And the diviner, him or herself, is not just reading the patterns in the divination bones. This is the tool in Ngoma. They're not just reading the patterns. She's also attuning to the fact that everyone present is reading them too, in their own way, and they're giving feedback constantly in a ritual sense. So she's iterating the story that emerges from the bones based on the feedback she's getting from the collective. It is quite a skill because she knows the spirits could talk to them too. I mean, how could she dare to presume the spirits would only talk through her? So we're looking here at a process of collective intelligence, which is how people make sense of things together to know what to do next. And for those of you, and I know there are people on the call who are interested in complexity science, and particularly if you're familiar with Dave Snowden's anthro-complexity, you're going to see the similarities. And you'll know why people often say, in quotes, modern science is just waking up to what indigenous science knew all along. Now, this is usually well-intentioned, but right then and there, when we made that statement, we just did it again. An assumption from deep in the North Atlantic psyche. We've just declared an equivalence. We've said it's what they knew all along. And that equivalence, unintentionally, can flatten modern complexity science and ancient indigenous science into something that is the same. And we do that, well-intentioned, without necessarily knowing much about either of them. Because while there are clearly consistencies, areas where they independently converge on perhaps a practice that seems similar, they are also different. So in complexity, we might talk about agency being distributed. In Ngoma, people may say something like, the ancestors are everywhere like water. The ancestors are everywhere like water. It speaks to a similar pattern, perhaps, but it's also different in a meaningful way. And maybe this deep cosmology of ancestors, which speaks to how we see identity, fluidity, land, is more relevant. In fact, maybe precisely what's relevant. And it can get lost in the flattening by assuming that spirits and agency are the same. Like uncertainty experts who doubt we can learn from the past, right? When our maps and models are working, we need to be open to difference because they're not going to work in rupture, in deep uncertainty. Because when we hit the space, which I think a lot of us are feeling, the models and maps we're using are already out of date. We're just trying to keep them functional. So that's the little opening, and I'm going to throw over to Joan Lurie, who is going to, I think, tell us about a time in the 1990s in this country, in South Africa, where some people realized that their comfort zone, what was most familiar to them, had in fact become a risk as well. And also what it took to step outside of it, even when stepping outside of that comfort zone, for them probably felt unthinkable. Okay, Joan, it's over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nicola. I love the how you have kind of called out the flattening that we tend to do, and I think that is really important in terms of what I was noticing in the last call, which to me was such a fascinating call, but that the question that so many people are grappling with is, how do we navigate uncertainty as if uncertainty is something that is outside of us? There is uncertainty in the world. There is uncertainty in what's going to happen next in our organizations, what is going to happen to me and my role next in an AI context. And I think that is one form of thinking about navigating uncertainty. And I'm very curious about this book now, which I will make an assumption about, is about how to navigate the uncertainty that you are in, versus this other form of uncertainty, which is an uncertainty that you have to grasp hold of yourself, which is inside you, inside us, in terms of not knowing. And that what I'm noticing as a pattern is that the tendency is looking outward to the uncertainty we're embedded in versus coming to terms with our not being certain and not reaching for and grasping for being in the certainty in order to navigate the uncertainty. And I'm noticing that pattern with so many leaders I'm working with, that instead of sitting in the discomfort of their own not knowing, they're grasping for a toolkit about certainty as if that is going to help them navigate. And without an awareness that being so certain about where to next. And I had a beautiful example of it today in a coaching session where someone just so clearly articulated to me, and this is the way it's going to get solved, and this is what I'm going to do. And he was so not aware of his own not being right. And I think the paradox of that is what I kind of came to me in the last conversation, is that the biggest risk we face maybe is in the grasping for the certainty, in the collapse and the reduction into we have to have the answer, we have to know what that is. And so it's this paradoxical idea about how to learn to be in the uncertainty and the comfort of it for yourself and in the not knowing, which we really don't have a muscle for, I think, so many of us individually. But I think then my other kind of thought was, we can't rely on individuals all building that muscle for themselves. If that is a muscle we need to build, I think it is actually more a systemic practice that we have to put into our systems, almost like an architecture. If I think about it in organizational terms, I think if leaders see their role not only in terms of finding ways forward, but also see their role as creating uncertainty infrastructure or architecture into the organizational systems we're in, we should be attending to that, so that those practices, like the divination practices, certainly not the same, but reminiscent of, are practices and rituals where individuals can come together, either in organizations that already exist or in forming some kind of ecosystems where we come together in being in the practice of uncertainty for ourselves and building that as a muscle for individuals, but in the context of containment. And what I think is really interesting for us to start to imagine and design our way into, and I've been playing with quite a bit of this, is what are those practices? What are those rituals? And it brought me to the story which I shared with Nicola and Stephen and Tamsin the other night, when I was in a company in the 1990s where a CEO saw his role when we were in the transition out of apartheid into our first democratic election, steeped in uncertainty, where he saw his role. He was a very seasoned businessman, but saw his role in the context of changing the culture of his organization, helping people navigate that uncertainty. He is not knowing how to do that, but experimenting with boundary conditions, practices, rituals, inviting us all into what is that holding container. And what he saw as imperative was to create those containing conditions. And there were a whole lot of practices that actually we put in then, which helped very frightened, very nervous, very anxious, very, people that were on the cusp of war. He created containing spaces for us to navigate that together. And I think there is beautiful lessons in that story, which I think can be a guide for us. So I think that lens is important. I think linked to that lens is, yes, we have to navigate it ourselves, the emotion of what it means to be in this uncertainty. And I think Stephen brings this beautiful lens about being in the different moods of uncertainty and the role that Mandela played, which Stephen's going to share with us. And for me, what's so intriguing about this kind of segue is the degree that, while I'm talking about the systemic containing conditions, the degree to which someone like Mandela was able to create that containment for himself, and what that looks like in containing his own emotions and moods and holding that so artfully for our system at the time. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thanks. Thanks. So I think there are a lot of great thoughts and ideas that have kind of that are emerging here this evening. And I'd like to see if I can work with Mandela as a way of kind of bringing out some of these thoughts. The first one I'd like to go to is Nicola's kind of pointing out, the kind of danger of reducing one way of thinking to another way of thinking. When she said, there's the Ngoma, 4,000 years old, a particular way of thinking and being that's emerged over kind of a long, long period of time. And then there's complexity thinking. Um, and I think that Nicola was saying there are a lot of overlaps between them. Um, but the danger is in reducing them to the same. Rather, it's by working with the enrichment, or it's by working with the differences that they're not exactly the same way of thinking, that where a lot of productive, enriching, edifying kind of thinking can emerge, where we don't just try and say we're all the same, we're all the same. Rather, we allow our differences to be edifying rather than kind of reductionistic. And I think Mandela was kind of a genius in working with difference. That his dialogues with people, he was able in himself to embrace difference in himself, and he was able to embrace otherness of the other as well in himself. And then maybe just linking that with some of the things that Joan was saying, especially kind of, the feelings of uncertainty, that in uncertainty, there's a lot of kind of feeling of threat. There's a lot of kind of worry. There's also a lot of excitement, by the way, in uncertainty as well. But again, let's say the dominant Western discourse has been this urge to produce certainty the whole time. We want certainty, we want control, in the belief that if we control, we're going to get rid of uncertainty. But I think some of the kind of thing that Joan was saying is that actually controlling uncertainty can also create bigger forms of uncertainty. And I think we see that on a political level quite easily. The nationalisms that tend to want to ward off uncertainty actually create more uncertainty for themselves and for others. I think we see that in apartheid. I think every white election in apartheid was fought on the basis of the black peril or die swart gevaar. And no action of apartheid kinds of controls lessened uncertainty. In fact, it created and enhanced more uncertainty and more estrangement between people. So, in that sense, the very search for certainty is actually a destructive way of working with things. And so we need to ask, well, we need to question this need for certainty or the will for certainty. Why do we go for certainty in the first place? What is the intention behind uncertainty? And I think to do that, we need to understand more about the moods and the emotional dimensions of uncertainty, because as rational as we may be, when uncertainty kind of knocks on our door, when it freaks us out, no matter how rational we are, our rationality is going to serve our fear of uncertainty. So we've got to understand how deeply embedded this fear of uncertainty is, and actually how we don't even want to look at the fear of uncertainty. I mean, we generally tend to think that uncertainty is an individual problem that's dealt with in psychotherapy. But there are actually some writers who have maintained that the hidden discourse of the West is this need for certainty and this fear of uncertainty, the need to secure security gets in the way of developing ourselves. So I think Mandela had a particular way of dealing with uncertainty. Um, he embraced uncertainty. Um, Rather than walking away from uncertainty, he walked into uncertainty. And I want to use a particular example from the kind of history of Mandela in this case. So 1993 was a dangerous year in South Africa. Political negotiations towards a democratic South Africa were very volatile. There was a lot of tension between the ANC and the apartheid government of the day. The dialogue wasn't working smoothly. And in the midst of this, the leader who was apparently second in command to Mandela in popularity in the ANC, Chris Hani, was assassinated on the 10th of May, I think it was 1993. And after that assassination, there was a total freakout. We expected civil war, and things were heading towards civil war. Um, and on that day of the assassination, Mandela was at his home in the Eastern Cape, and I think he was receiving a group of rugby players, and he was called to the phone, told, what had happened, went back to speak to the rugby people. After them, he went to the parents of Chris Hani to kind of, commiserate and give his, to commiserate and condolences. And then there's a particular account of what happened to Mandela after this, and it comes from a book by Justice Malema. And he speaks about Mandela as kind of almost languishing in the airport, in the airport in Transkei, that he didn't go straight away from the Transkei or the then Transkei to Johannesburg to work with his comrades in combating the immediate crisis overwhelming South Africa. He was waiting, they say, for Bantu Holomisa, who was one of the political leaders of the time, and a friend and enemy, if I can say, of Mandela. So Mandela knew how to work with binaries, with kind of not either or thinking. He could work with friends and enemies at the same time, which again, I think is very difficult for the Western mindset to be able to embrace difference like that. And so Mandela was at this airport, and his people in Johannesburg were saying, "Come on, you've got to get back to. We got to get you on TV at 7 o'clock, and then we got to get you on TV at 9 o'clock," because he wasn't getting back. And then we got to get you on TV at 10 o'clock. And eventually he arrived in Johannesburg, and they took him straight away to the South African Broadcasting Corporation, where he was to make a speech. The speech was written by his speech writers. Um, Mandela delivered the speech, but by all accounts of people at that speech, Mandela was not present emotionally. in that speech. He was quite detached, and actually, he was in a state of huge grief, huge anger, and also huge anxiety at the same time. The anger and the grief were at the assassination of Chris Hani. The anger was in the potential for civil war in South Africa at that moment. And so civil war was an existential threat. It was a real possibility. It would put all progress towards negotiations. It would bump it off. And Mandela knew this. So he was working with all these threats. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that Mandela wasn't this controlled, rational master that we think he is. Mandela was very deeply affected. He wasn't holding perspective um, as the way we are taught to believe Mandela held perspective. But the point here is Mandela knew how to work with the breakdown of perspective. Most of us run away. Mandela walked in to the breakdowns of perspective, and he lived and he thought from within the breakdown. And so 3 days later, he delivered an address to the nation that was his address, that came from his heart, um, and in which he was able to contain uh, all the different emotions that people were experiencing. And he's a masterful therapist leader in the way that he was able to contain, because he simultaneously acknowledged all the anguish, all the pain, all the grief, but he also challenged the people of South Africa to go beyond their anguish, their grief, and pain. He challenged them in the name of being able to be attuned to the greater good, that is a democratic future for South Africa. So he was able to take both the being kind of absorbed in the anxiety and grief of the particular moment, to kind of not let it go into civil war, but to take a nation and allow them to see that there was a greater good by working through their grief and emotion on a national level. So this is a very therapeutic kind of speech that Mandela gave here. And even towards the end of the speech, he is consistently not trying to preach to people, not trying to tell us what to do, not instruct, not even motivate like a traditional politician would. He's saying our actions that we carry out tonight will determine how we handle our grief. Are we going to take our grief into reaffirming our commitment to democracy, or is our grief going to overwhelm us and we're going to descend into kind of civil war here? So even then, he wasn't controlled by the need for certainty. He stayed in the uncertainty of not knowing, and he created this we space for South Africa. Black and white, black anger, white fear. He was able to bring all of these different kind of emotions together in the name of a greater good. And so to me, Mandela was this person who was able to work with plurality. He was able to engage in dialogues across difference, which had been developing for most of his life. Um, but I think it's kind of, he provided a container, and that's what we're speaking about here, is we have uncertainty. Um, we also have here a kind of particular experience on a kind of national level of uh, containing um, a threat. Yes, of course, he didn't contain the whole threat, but he certainly did a lot to contain it. I want to call this, at the risk of being totally wrong, I want to call this an Ubuntu space that Mandela created for South Africa on that night, a we space. Uh, but I could be very wrong in my understanding of Ubuntu. So I'll leave it in there. Yeah, yeah.
Thanks, Stephen.
Mm,
It is so wonderful to hear stories that we think we're familiar with, and then you get another dimension
mm,
that takes the story further. So thank you for that. And I'm going to add something there, and it touches on this space, and Joan called it architecture. Because Mandela was very deeply trained through having grown up. I mean, he was a herd boy when he was little, in the Transkei. He was deeply entrained in Ngoma culture, and what he had was this deeply ingrained understanding of ritual and how you could use it. And ritual is a natural architecture. It is, I mean, if you look at ritual, it is something that has always got a container around it. Ritual can be contained by the three steps you do when you kind of go into the bathroom, for example, to brush your teeth. You're doing it that same way. Or it's when you kneel down to pray and you put a cloth on. Or you have the ability, when you really understand ritual structure, to create the possibility of anything almost becoming the container. So this is architecture. And I think what was happening there was he was using his speech as a ritual container. He was using the fact that he was obviously a statesman at this stage. People were incredibly amazed and moved by him, at the same time furious, on a knife's edge. And then he had to make a speech. So I mean, I wonder, and as you said, we don't really know, but I mean, he was not, he was very human, and of course, he's going to get rattled by this. But another thing that Mandela could have been doing there was going into a ritual space to allow his speech to become a ritual itself, that could then hold what was needed to hold, because he couldn't hold it. He's just a person. He's an amazing person, but he's just a person. But what he understands is ritual. He understands architecture. And that containment is very powerful. He did something very similar in the 1960s when he declared war. And he did that ritually from the dock. He was about to be basically put away. Potentially, he was going to be executed for treason. But he used his speech, and I'm sure you know lots about it, Steve, but he used his speech in such a powerful ritual moment to essentially declare war on South Africa. And what he said was very profound. He said, "We've always been prepared to die. We've always been prepared to die for freedom. But now we have to be prepared to kill as well." And that was a ritual declaration, which changed. It changed so much from that one speech. It was very, very memorable. Yeah, beautiful. Thank you.
Jen, do you
And
want to
maybe I'll
pick up?
just sort of add one more thing. Go for it. Yeah, sorry, go for it.
No, you carry on. I was just.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll just sort of add one thing to make a sort of link is, it's very, very difficult. And I'll talk from my experience to actually go into this space where we are trusting whatever comes next without knowing what it is. It's really, really hard. It sounds kind of like we could do it, and especially if you've been a mom, and it's like you've got these kind of skills. But I just remember very clearly when I was taught to divine, you've got literally 20 bones, 25 bones, and they're all different and they all mean different things. And they can walk in different directions when they fall. And there's going to be a lot of patterns. I mean, moving towards infinity, basically, as to how the patterns could emerge from those bones. And I thought I could do it. And when I threw the bones, my overriding feeling was nausea, absolute nausea. I looked at them, and all I wanted to do was run out of the room. really. And, except that I was, it's a very kind of hierarchical system, and you're absolutely in submission to your teacher at that stage. So I couldn't have run out the room. But honestly, everything in my body wanted to do that. And again, that's a space where we can use ritual to create the architectures that Joan is talking about. And one of the people I trained with in constellations, her name is Stephanie Hartung. She's the founder of Constellators International, as she's based in Europe. She used to do a little ritual for herself for a long time in coming into being able to do this constellation process where there's a lot of uncertainty. And I'm sorry, there's a swear word. Can you beep it out? Because I'm quoting, it's in quotes. And she said once she heard all the issues that were needing to be constellated, she would force herself to walk straight into the center of them and slightly almost kneel down. Sometimes she would literally kneel down. And then she would say, "What the fuck do we do now?" And she would just let slowly, so that everyone knew that the facilitator was clueless. And it was a powerful statement of ritual that kind of enabled this, what you said, Stephen, this we space, or what this ritual container, or this architecture that Joan is talking about.
So I think if I may just add there, I think this notion of what the fuck to do now, I think if we can really, really ask that kind of question from the depths of our being, that for me is the space that working with uncertainty uh, requires of us to be in that moment of not knowing. I mean, in the history of Western philosophy, it was Socrates. Socrates says, "The one thing I know is that I don't know." And he went out with not knowing. And the world opened up to him because he was totally attuned to not knowing. Whereas this need for certainty uh, totally pushes that not knowing away. Um, and again, it comes back when we confront another who disturbs our system of thinking or our way of thinking. Can we stay in that space of disturbance uh, instead of reducing the other to our perspective, which is what I think we tend to do. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what I would want to notice and call out here is that when we are dealing with this idea of uncertainty, we are so steeped in multiple paradoxes, and that when we call out things like, "What the fuck do we do now?" I think, yes, that is one practice. But if I think back to another practice that is really needed, which is paradoxical, is to create really firm boundary conditions so that those kinds of questions can get navigated. And if I think back to the story in South Africa, what the role that that CEO played at that time was, "I don't know what the answer is here. We've never been there before. We have to experiment and find a way forward together." But what he made non-negotiable and put in a really firm boundary condition was that this was a way forward that had to be in non-racial terms, and that he created non-negotiables that were equally imperative in the not knowing. So in the not knowing, he was also really knew what he had to make non-negotiable in that context. And so there is this deep paradox about when you're creating containing spaces, you have to put in boundary conditions and some non-negotiables, which become the kind of riverbeds that the flow can happen through, right? It's not a chaotic fallout either, which is why I'm so sort of curious about what are those architectures, the scaffolds, those boundary conditions that are absolutely necessary for being in the not knowing, so that it doesn't feel overwhelming, chaotic, that there is some containment. And the role of leader is to create those containing spaces, I think, which include non-negotiables. If I think back to some of the things that he forced some of the senior management into was to cross the border to go and meet with the ANC that were at that time that was still, banned, and the fear and the terror. But he forced them into that. That was a non-negotiable position, and letters were put under his door in the hotel room, about the terror that some of those leaders felt because they lived out in areas like Piet Retief and places where it wasn't just the nationalist government, apartheid government, it was the Avia Bear that was, and their fear of what they had to go back to. But there were certain conditions and non-negotiables that held the system through, right? And it's a very important sort of thing for us to pay attention to, of how to be in the paradox of this, of the not knowing, and some of the boundary that we need in order to hold us through that. Rivers without banks, things like, we can think about it in multiple ecological terms, where it's very important for us to understand how emergence can happen, but within certain boundary conditions and certain navigational constructs, and not absolute, this is the way forward in a linear way, but these are the holding frames. I mean, if I think about it from, say, even a grieving practice in a Jewish tradition, if you follow that grieving practice, this is what you do on day one, this is what you do for the first week, this is what you do. And these are rituals which hold people through liminal spaces and transitional spaces. And I think we have to think about these paradoxically, and really in the current uncertainty we face, what are the organizational rituals, practices, and boundary conditions that we can put in so that we can be in this very, as Alexis said, it's not something we're going to feel we're able to do alone, or we can hold alone, or that we can expect individuals to have to do alone. So I think it's a very important thing for us to move to, well, what do these look like if we had to think about them?
I'd love to come back to that, but about ritual and the structure versus almost anti-structure. But Godlief, how do I say that? Yeah, you've got your
It's
hand up.
one of these guttural names, Godelieve in Flemish.
Godlief.
Yeah, but Godlieve is also good.
Okay.
Thanks very much for this extremely rich conversation. I broke out of another meeting actually to be here because I thought this was so exciting and I want to read your book as well. So put the link in if you can. Just listening to the three interventions, I thought this is as much a conversation about certainty as about uncertainty, because in how you cast this, and especially when you start to talk about the spaces, the rituals, the containment practices, etc. I hear there is at another level there's a need for that sort of certainty. So my underlying question is: are we only talking about uncertainty of not knowing? Because you resonate all a certain certainty of a moral embracing, of doing something. So there is a certainty there. There's also a material certainty that is pre-assumed, because I assume if people are dying of hunger, they're cast into their material existence in ways that most of us do not experience to that extent. And so this is why I was struck by what Stephen was saying about or somebody was mentioning about Mandela saying, are you willing to stand for all this with your life? And are you willing to kill for it? I mean, those are, I think, those boundaries, I think, not many of us reach. Most of us are uncomfortable. I look at the backgrounds of everybody in the call. Nobody's out on the street sitting next to a dustbin. So I think we're in that sense still very certain. And on the basis of that sort of material certainty, we can have these conversations. So I think it's thinking out loud. What certainties are somehow still assumed or needed in order to embrace the uncertainties we're talking about here? And I think the containment space discussion is one example of it. I mean, that is actually creating a sort of certainty that there is collectives that can do this together, etc., etc. So, I mean, it's a puzzle in my head a little bit, but I hope it makes some sort of sense.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just reading now. Ilse's just written the original meaning of the Latin root of certainty apparently means to sift or to separate. And so there's a discernment that comes along with these things. And they almost go together. Certainty, uncertainty, and discernment seem to be linked, listening to what you're talking about there. Um, yeah, that's a beautiful addition. I really like that.
Yeah.
Anything else?
And
Yeah, go for it.
maybe just to throw in also, that I mean, therapy is another kind of container for working with the paradox of certainty and uncertainty. Um, in principle, therapy provides a space, a safe space to work through uncertainty. Um, and I think it's also very ritualistic in its practices, especially if you go back to Freudian or psychodynamic notions of therapy. That the psychoanalyst, for example, um, opens the door in the same way every day of the week that you go to analysis. They'll look at you in the same way. They won't deviate. There's a very, very strong structure, very, very kind of almost rigid structure to the therapeutic process. But I guess Freud believed there very strongly that that's a holding space, the therapeutic space. So I guess we can be speaking of multiple kinds of containment.
Yeah.
The one that interests me most, though, just going back to Mandela, um, is so I'm a therapist, but so I don't live in my clients' problems. I'm kind of a bit distant from it. Not that I haven't been through the same stuff myself in my own time in life, but what amazes me about Mandela is that he was in the state of mind that the people were in. He was angry. He was mourning, and he was very uncertain at the same time as he was providing a kind of we space container for the people. And I think that leaders like that are very crucial, that can be there, that can be with the we in the same meaning, and not simply like, say, me as a therapist standing at a objective kind of distance.
Mm. I mean, interestingly enough, I mean, I think that the amount of uncertainty we have to grapple with hasn't really changed. But what has changed is our relationship to it over time, quite significantly. And I think what has also changed, if I'm comparing where we are now with Ngoma traditions, what we're experiencing around uncertainty now is existentially dangerous. I mean, like Joan mentioned, that it was an existential risk in South Africa. We really could have gone to all-out bloody war. And that would have been very different. Some people experienced war in different parts of South Africa. It was an all-out war, but a lot of the country wasn't in all-out war. There were safe zones, shall we put that seemed to be safe, but weren't entirely. And that's different now, is that if you're talking about climate change, we're talking about existential risk at a scale of the globe that we've never really had to grapple with as a global community. And I think that makes it a very, very interesting reality. But uncertainty has always been there. And I think we've always had a fairly paradoxical response to it. The point I made there was whatever we do to try and manage uncertainty and make things more certain will actually increase uncertainty at the same time, because there are going to be unintended consequences. There are going to be rebound effects.
And I'll,
Okay, sorry, I was going to call on
sorry,
Samantha. Go for it. Samantha,
me,
you've got your hand
Samantha.
up.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sorry, I was just unmuting. I hope you can hear me.
Can do.
Can you hear me?
Can see the beautiful
Yes,
Okay,
view
good.
behind you too.
Okay. Um, I'm really excited about this discussion, and I was joining while I was on the road. And I'm usually based in Nairobi. It's an urban area, but right now I'm in the rural area, actually in the community my father comes from. And I've been attending these discussions because I've been seeking to define certain things that were in my upbringing, in my father's upbringing, and also my grandfather's practice that we don't see articulated elsewhere. And so I've been on this journey. It's been maybe intentional for 2 years, this being the second year. And my grandfather was what you would in South Africa, they would probably call him a sangoma. It's only in Kenya we have a distinction, and in my community we have a distinction where we have people who practice divination in order to do evil, and then there's people who still practice divination, but more from a healing perspective. And so I found this discussion quite interesting, especially what Joanne was talking about in terms of
Sorry,
boundaries.
Samantha, can
I
you
found that
turn your
very
camera
compelling.
off? Can you turn your camera off?
Yes,
Because the
off.
bandwidth is
Okay.
struggling. But if you turn your camera off, we can
Okay.
hear you better.
Okay.
Yeah?
No problem.
Yeah, that'll be better.
No problem. Yeah. Okay. So I found that compelling around the boundaries because I think this is something that is missing, that making that distinction, because it feels like when you're pursuing emergent ideas without the boundaries, you can continue to replicate what you're trying to move away from in new ways. So it becomes innovation, but innovation that is innovating within the same paradigm. So that was one thing that I found compelling. But I also liked what Stephen was talking about in terms of a therapist leader, because what happened from my grandfather's heritage was his sons, who would be now my father's generation, became leaders in the natural sense, you know. So my one of my uncles was a chief in our community, and our kind of leadership is that kind of leadership that you're describing as a therapist leader. And I didn't have the terminology, but now it makes a lot of sense because in our community, when Godly Ever is talking about uncertainty, we come from a community that has a lot of uncertainty, especially basic uncertainty around food, availability of food. And so in my community, when you meet people from my community, one question they always ask is it raining? Has it rained? Because if there's climate change, it means that if there's no rain, there's no food. And so that's uncertainty at that level. And so I'm enjoying the conversation. I'm liking the definition. And I just wanted to make that contribution.
Amazing. Thank you. Joan, are you wanting to respond to that?
Yes, I mean, there's so many beautiful threads in there. You know, one I think that is important, I think would be important for us to pick up on is the distinction between being a therapist in that role and, you know, being a therapist leader. And if, you know, if that is even required, like, is that something that we can put on leaders to be therapists or forms of therapeutic, as opposed to system leaders, which the role is less about being the therapist or trying to model therapeutic practice, but rather thinking about what are the systemic practices, the containing conditions in our organizations and in our systems, which can hold people through this uncertainty. So I think it is interesting to think about it through the lens of therapeutic, and always I'm looking at the paradox and what could be deeply problematic about that if we're kind of putting that role onto leaders who have no equipment for that. I think it's a very different question to think about what are the containing structures that we can help leaders think through and put in place, as opposed to how do we help leaders take on a more therapeutic role. I do think that's an important difference.
No, I agree. Can
Can I
I
come
jump
in
in
with
there,
that?
Stephen? That I mean, I'm also just on Joan's exact point. I'm just very aware that in Western therapeutic traditions, they generally come with the assumption of the one person being an expert, right, and the other person isn't. And that for me is very much the distinction. And and so often I say, well, the diviner is like a therapist, except that they're not. That they're trying not to be the expert. They've kind of had that sort of, they're sort of trained in a process of deep humility, which is actually quite nasty, in order to stop the assumption that the expert that they carry is able to hold everyone else, because they can't. Their expertise is only goes as far as it's the same as before. And when diviners come into the game, it's because the old ways of doing things before aren't working anymore. And so we have to find a new way where no one is the expert. And that for me is an interesting dichotomy that I work with sometimes.
I'd like to make a few points. I think that we at the moment are in the danger of reducing paradigms and prioritizing one over the other paradigms.
Sure.
I don't think it's a matter of either therapy or systems. Um, I think that they speak out of different worlds, and I think it's productive to work with the different worlds out of which they speak rather than reduce one to the other. I also think that therapy actually um, is not only about the discourse of an expert. Um, there's so much therapy that actually is about uh, walking together and not not coming across as an expert. But I guess my general point is, how do we work with difference here? Rather than eliminate it or prioritize. Yeah.
Emily, do you want to jump in?
Yes, good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you so much. This has been such a fascinating start to my Thursday morning. And just to emphasize as well, I am absolutely not part of this discipline naturally. I'm a marine social scientist, and this came across my LinkedIn, and I was really fascinated to see if there were any ways that I could link in what you're doing to the way that I work. And specifically, I do community engagement, both in the UK and the Caribbean, UK overseas territories. And a big part of my focus is trying to see how we can decolonize our work, make it more ethical, and kind of be aware of my positionality as a Western researcher going into these places and trying to reduce the impact of that on the work that we do. So my question is, I'm trying to figure out how to put it into words, but I found it really interesting talking about how a lot of non-Western communities, this conversation that you had is like a lot more natural, whereas in the Western world, we do tend to come to things with this more like simple mindset. If we, or myself, try to go to communities with this uncertainty mindset, do we need to, or do you think there is any need to consider like the ethical implications of that? And I'm thinking in terms of a lot of the people that I work with, for example, I think like the previous question, deal with uncertainty. There can be things like food resource for fish. There can be historic difficulties with colonialism and the impacts of that. And part of me wants to embrace this uncertainty mindset and use it to improve the ways that we work with communities. But the other part is very aware of the potential risks that that could bring. in terms of how engagement is perceived and the effectiveness of it. I hope that makes sense, because I'm trying to kind of draw lines between what you're talking about and how I can apply it. And yeah, if anybody has any thoughts on that, I'd be really interested.
I'm really happy to give some thoughts and to hear other people. So I think this is the huge, huge work, Emily. This you spoke about decolonizing the work. And again, so much of it is about good intentions, right? Because, you know, if food's the problem, let's go and fix the food situation. And yes, if there is an absolute, you know, if we're in a situation of famine, just get the food there. So yes, under crisis conditions, there's just, you know, not an issue. But I mean, with how we do it. But, you know, when we do work in any community that is still connected to ways of thinking and modes of thinking that are not just, you know, super individualistic or atomistic, or just it's about the work itself. No, it's not. It's about the history that comes with that work. And if I walk into a situation without my history there, and without my being able to speak to that history there in a way that's not kind of pseudo and put on, you know, because we can also do that. You know, people feel it, and it just interferes. It has agency in and of itself. And so for me, you know, the work is to be able to do that and to say, you know, I'm a descendant of colonial settlers. And that doesn't mean I agree with colonialism. And again, I'm going back to Ilse's point, which is uncertainty is about discernment. So being able to work in uncertainty is about discernment. So if I declare, yeah, and I'm a descendant of colonial settlers, and that means it's almost impossible for me to have a non-dual approach to what I'm doing, almost impossible, right? No matter how uncertain I get and how I love to dance with uncertainty and Donella Meadows and all of that stuff, it's still there. It is still there, and it's going to take me out. And if it, you know, if I'm not aware of that, I am going to be imposing it in the work I do. And so this for me, and then Stephen, and thanks for the sort of elbow, and you're absolutely right. You've got to see where in our culture, as in sort of Western culture, therapeutic places often offer an extraordinary opportunity to begin to work with our projections that are incredibly valuable, and that frankly would maybe not be needed in other contexts. And to Stephen's point, you know, and if we have imposed this way of working or one way of working into another context, it can also do something really deeply problematic. And you know, where in fact a particular healing tradition can unintentionally erase another healing tradition simply because it's focused on the individual. It's not wrong. It just means when you focus on the individual, you erase potentially a local indigenous tradition that is far more collectivist in its understanding. So thanks for raising that, Emily. You can see I'm a little bit passionate about it, but I think it's really big work and really important.
I think one of the kind of threads through from the last session was the plurality of uncertainty. And I think I'm really pleased you picked up the contextual piece, because that was what was on my mind. You know, we have to think about the plurality of uncertainty, very hard to even say it, in contextual terms. You know, when we are navigating a kind of uncertainty for ourselves individually, a loss, a grieving process, and not knowing for ourselves, going into an individual personal therapeutic process is absolutely critical and vital for so many. But trying to kind of look at the application of that into a systemic uncertainty and organizational uncertainty, and applying the same individual therapeutic processes or containers from that context into another, I think becomes problematic. So it's not that we're not holding not even being in the non-binary, it's being able to hold the plurality in multiple contextual terms. And I think one of the things about being in complex systems is that we're able to layer in more context, and that we don't sort of then reduce to, oh, this worked here, so it's going to work in this context, or this kind of uncertainty equals the same. So we have all these, like, this is how you navigate uncertainty. Well, no, I think this is how individuals navigate it. This is how organizations that are intact organization systems navigate it. This is how families can. This is how communities can. This is how we do it in these religions. And I think we have to embrace all those distinctive uncertainties and the multiple contextuals that we're in, and not go that we can kind of pluck things from different places and just put them in. I think that is risk creating to some degree. Yeah.
Amazing. Alexis, jump in.
Yeah, since I'm the one in the chat that keeps saying that I do think therapeutic effects have place in systems, I just want to clarify what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about doing therapy to other people. I'm talking about staying with myself, doing my own sort of therapeutic work in that space so that I can, instead of passing off anxiety to somebody else, I metabolize it here and then I interact. And that is therapeutic. It's not therapy in any way, shape, or form, but it is therapeutic. And if we are in systems that can be toxic, then they can also be therapeutic. And if leaders can be toxic, then they can also be therapeutic. But it's self-work. It's not about somebody else, and it's not about designing. I mean, designing architectures with the right attitude is perfect. It's great. But if the right attitude isn't designing those architectures, then we're also at risk for making other people do stuff that we ourselves aren't willing to do. They can grapple with uncertainty. I'm designing how they grapple with uncertainty. So there's a problem there as well.
I think that's such a critical distinction between doing what we need to do that is therapeutic for us, and putting leaders in roles of being therapist leaders or doing therapy. I think those are three very different domains. It's a very useful distinction.
I think that not all therapy is psychotherapy. And so it's not all therapy of the individual. Therapy, I mean, just going back to Mandela's speech, this was a highly therapeutic speech without him being a therapist. But it did bring the people together. He worked through national emotions, that the grief and the anger were very, very intense, and it could have exploded into civil war very, very quickly. And he was able to kind of bring out that grief and bring out the anger and bring out the anxiety, which is a very therapeutic process without it being psycho or individual therapy. It was a national therapy. He brought the we together through working with the emotions.
I think he did, Stephen, and I think that was the right thing to do in that context. Absolutely. And when Mandela stood in the dock and said, and now, guys, we're going to war, because we're at a point where it's no longer okay to just die for liberation. We're going to have to kill for it too. I mean, would you also classify that as therapy? Because in my book, he's doing something very similar, but just with a obviously in a different direction, with a different outcome. A genuine question.
Yeah, look, the kind of therapy I come from, which is phenomenology, would definitely class that it's kind of, we call it a blink of the eye moment, and it's called an Augenblick in German. But the blink of the eye moment is suddenly a new reality is disclosed,
Yeah.
and that's what Mandela repeatedly did in his leadership practice. He repeatedly kind of disclosed new worlds in very quick moments.
Yeah, and that is a very, very powerful thing for a leader to do. No, I totally get that.
So, and also just leading from that, this wasn't a technique. that Mandela learned. It wasn't a skill that Mandela developed by going to university or anything like this. This emerged out of Mandela's way of being. So he had not just the kind of skill of being a leader, he had the being of a leader. His being was leading. Um, and I think that's something that many modern leaders don't have. Uh, I think so much leadership is about method, it's about skill, it's about technique, it's about standing back, the helicopter perspective. But when your being is transformed, you're leading from a completely different space. And that to me is why Mandela is still exemplary today, because we don't get political leaders working from that space of being. We get so many transactional kinds of leaders that haven't gone to the depths of being that Mandela went to. And so to me, that's, we spoke about existential threats. Existential threats are threats that take us to being. They take us out of the everyday and they take us to this ontological level, that Mandela lived on. So he didn't need to train as a therapist.
I'd be interested, Joan, in how you compare that to the PG Bison example. I mean, maybe a different level of
Yeah,
containment.
I think in that context, at that time, what I think some of the rituals that we wove in, and Pip was on the call and she was part of that, so I'd love to bring in your perspectives here. But I think back to that time and the many things that we put in place, which were shared sense-making rituals. It didn't, things like bringing people from very different levels of the organization, from very different walks of life and experience, and brought them together to share their stories and to talk about their perspective. And so the resource that management and leadership put in was to create these containing spaces where people coming in with multiple assumptions about each other and about each other's lives were put into juxtaposition, and in facilitated spaces, sense-making spaces, were forced to confront their own assumptions and to be in co-understanding and sense-making together, which was such a helpful way of navigating the uncertainty that we were in. I think another practice and ritual was having people go into contexts that they had never been in before. White managers having to go and sleep in the township at night and come into work, travel for 2-3 hours, not in their Mercedes Benz, but, so putting people in different contextual spaces, these are kind of rituals and practices which disrupt people's certainty and their sense of what the world is, and they're put into other people's perspective or into other contexts which disrupt that. I think, there were multiple kind of containing things that people had to step into in their roles in those systems, which brought connection. I think these are rituals of connection. These are rituals of coherence building. These are rituals of care. They are important ones where this is the kind of architecture I'm talking about, that we're not leaving it to individuals, but we're constructing these rituals and practices and contextual opportunities for sense making and for putting people in difference and being able to be in connection in ways that they wouldn't necessarily do for themselves or on their own. So those were some of the things that were appropriate in that context at that time. I think, what does that look like today in the uncertainties that some of the organizations face? Things that I'm playing with and experimenting with are sense-making containers where people just are invited in to come in and share what their assumptions are about the challenges that are being faced. And a practice which is you can't give your opinion or the answer, but you have to share what your hypothesis is. And then you have to invite in other hypotheses, and you can't disagree. You've just got to be in these generative spaces. So that we're creating containing rituals and practices and boundary conditions in those spaces, which are pulling people out of their own certainty and their own assumptions and what they think it is, and learning to hold that there are multiple perspectives and how they can be wrong, not only at an individual level, but also at a kind of subsystem level, at a whole system level. What are our current narratives? What are our current stories about ourselves or about others or about the problem that we face, that we could be in disruption of? And I think those are things that we've got to attend to and think about how we create that more deliberately. Because I think those are the practices that are going to scaffold and enable individuals to not be in their own certainty. And one thing I know about my work with systems is that even if you have the capacity, the systemic patterning often pulls you back into the expert, into the certainty. And so how do we, paradoxically contradict that need for certainty by pulling people paradoxically into the uncertainty in safe, containing practices that are scaffolds in? Because it's hard for individuals, for people to do alone, because of all the fear that sits with that, or the overwhelm that sits with that. So I think if I go back to that experience many years ago, how that created a container of both provocation, but also of care, and how helpful that was then, and what are the sum of not the same, but similar kinds of practices that we can help us navigate as a species, as organizations together. These are not individual uncertainties and fears alone. These are systemic existential things that we have to navigate together.
That's wonderful. John, I'm going to just respond to that with another quick story, because it's always contextual and it potentially always different. And you're speaking about holding both provocation and care together at the same time. And this does take an extraordinary kind of leader. And another example in South Africa, in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that took place around the sort of mid-90s, and essentially it was again a way to recognize that the country was at the edge of war. And in order to kind of land it into a space of what became the kind of Rainbow Nation, Mandela asked Archbishop Desmond Tutu to chair this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And Archbishop Desmond Tutu he deeply understood Ubuntu. This was his culture, but he'd also done a master's degree on it in London, and he was an archbishop in the Anglican Church. And what was really interesting was the space that he created with the TRC, this Truth and Reconciliation Commission, was very powerful. It gave rise to the outcome that South Africa needed. In other words, it actually it was part of not going down the level of war, to the root of war. And it was also very safe for people, because Ubuntu was in many respects interpreted very much through a Western theological lens, the idea of turn the other cheek. And while that was very powerful and ritually effective, it made a lot of people very angry. Because what they said was, hang on, I don't understand Ubuntu like that. Ubuntu is not like that. Ubuntu includes justice. And what we're seeing here is not justice. And there is a lot of anger even now, 20, 30 years later, about the absence of what people considered to be a restorative justice. And there was a very different process that was going on in Rwanda after the Rwandan genocide, which wasn't reinterpreted at all through any kind of theological lens, and which were these are the gacaca courts, in Rwanda. And these were very distributed. They were not procedural. They were quite wild. They were very embodied. They were situational. Um, and they were very, very different to the very procedural TRC in South Africa. And again, it's that point of saying, no one knows the perfect solution, but we're holding very different tensions in different ways. And we can certainly learn from all those processes.
Mm.
Yeah.
Love that example.
Thanks. Alexis, go for it.
Yeah, to respond to what Joan was saying about the container that you created, it's very much the work that I do with story and narrative within organizations, and it's great when you're there, when it's happening. What comes out, what people say, what people explore, what they discover, it's wonderful. Then there's the continuity issue, however, right? How do you carry that forward into the organization? How does that make an impact in the organization? And that's where I keep struggling, mainly because of the way organizations I designed. Nobody has time for that kind of stuff. They'll make time for it for like a day or a week or whatever it is, but they won't necessarily make time for it in their day-to-day. And what you said about the habits of the organization, but also our own habits pulling us back in an instant. You walk out of that room, you're back in the old habit. So of course, I believe very much in the work that I do with narrative, with polarities and all of that kind of stuff, but it really is work. It's time consuming. It requires individuals to take it seriously. It requires individual leaders to take it seriously and to work at it and to fail at it and to get their asses kicked and come back with their tails between their legs and try again. I mean, it really is work. And um, I don't see that catching on, right? I don't see that. It's not even about scaling. I don't even see it extending beyond the room we were just in.
Yeah, great.
That's a fascinating comment, and I know we're almost close to the end, so I don't know if anybody has any questions. But to your point, Alexa, somebody always said that when you're in that moment, you can hear the song playing, and you leave, and it plays a little bit longer, but then you actually, yeah. And it is how do you keep?
Sorry,
Sorry, Joan, Karen, yeah.
No, I think, Alexis, this is sort of why I'm kind of curious, because I do think there are organizations that are building these in as their own habits and rituals. I think that it is possible. I think we've got to keep asking the question of how to make it more possible and how do we embed these as not interventions that are once off, but these are actually the rituals and the practices and the habits, because I think that's what we're going to need to get us through this time. And that question is, well, how do we help organizations build it? I think there is growing imperative and interest in that. But I think one of the reasons people tend not to step into it is paradoxically because they've never done it before, and there's not a lot of places they can go and pluck, oh, that's what it looks like. Let's just impose it here. So, but I think that we've got to hold on to this question and look more and more for how to help organizations and leaders bring these practices, because it is possible. I'm seeing it happen, and I've seen it done. And I know what that brings. I know from that time, in that most precarious time in the 90s in South Africa, and I'm seeing it in pockets here. I think for me, the role I think is important to play is how do we bring this and normalize it, that this is how organizations function now.
I'm just reading Alexis's point. Sorry, Alexis's point. She says, haven't we also seen organizations that have embraced these practices in the past and are now throwing them overboard? And that is really quite naughty, because you're opening up a whole other discussion, but which is very, very rich. But I think it's very true.
That's so true.
Yeah. And I know for me, what was very useful was the point that I realized that almost anything can be a container. It depends on how you work with it. So in my field, we do a lot of disclosure work, and it is tick box complicated but not complex. You've got to meet the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures expectations, right? And you think how can you do that differently? Well, we can. We can take that as a container within which we can build the kind of generative space that Joan is doing, but it takes a little bit of humanness to do it. You've got to lean into this ability to do stuff that you didn't expect with something you've got. And so that for me, I call it a co-attentional space. It's a space where everyone is paying attention together, not intention. That's going to be the output, really. That the part is easy. That's going to tick the box in a scenario for Task Force on climate, related financial disclosures. But what is interesting, what is generative, what is real, and what is a deep ritual is the nature of the stories, to Alexis's point, that emerge in doing that together and being able to take anything as a container, not you, not me as the facilitator. I'm not the container. The container is the task. Because otherwise I become too laden and I become too inclined to be the expert who can hold this because I've done it before. But the fact is I have not, because no one has done what we need to do now before. So it must have
Love
been
that. Fantastic. Thank you. Are there any last words anybody wants to say? But I mean, I just think that's a great place to close this, Nicola. And I'm really grateful to all of you. Thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining. I will share the notes and the recording and the what next. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tenzin, for holding this amazing space. I just feel, very grateful.
Thanks.